Now part of the Darkcast Network. Welcome to Indie Podcasts with a Dark Side. Today's episode is part one of a two-parter of a very shocking and intricate case. Part one is the interview, and next week, part two will be the case. It's the interview you've been waiting for months. The interview with Hera McCloud, survivor of the Joaquin Rams serial killer. Right now on Love and Murder. Hey lambs, Kai here, and I have a very special episode for you. You know, I usually do true crime episodes based on research, police reports, etc., etc. Well, today's true crime case is coming straight from the source. Let's give a warm welcome to the guest who I'm about to interview, Hera McCloud. Hi, Hera. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Definitely. So what happened, Lamb, was I saw a blurb of Hera's story in a Facebook group, and I had to reach out to her. I hope I don't want to say enjoy her story, but I hope you understand her story. And I'm going to actually ask some questions that came from Yall and some questions about, true crime straight from the source. So first of all, Hera is the host of her own podcast, and it's called Seeking Different. Am I right?
Yeah, it's Seeking Different. It is a podcast celebrating non-traditional families, and also it's a mom and kid podcast. I do it with my 9-year-old daughter. And in addition to celebrating non-traditional families, we like to really unpack difficult topics that you might want to talk about with your kids from the perspective of a mom and a kid.
So when you're saying non-traditional families, what does that include? What does that mean?
So we are a single mom by choice family. And what that means is that, and you'll understand this more after you hear a little bit more about my story, but because of the tragedy that I experienced with my son and being in family court, when I went to have more kids, I thought to myself, I just want to do this myself. So I went and got a sperm donor for both of my daughters. And so, yeah, I'm a mom who chooses to be a single mom. I love it. And I think, part of our podcast is like kind of celebrating that all families look different. So we are a mom and kid family, which is non-traditional, but we've also done interviews with some of her donor siblings and their families. Some of them have two moms. Some of them have just one mom like us. There's other families that might have two dads, one dad. Maybe someone's raised by a grandparent. Maybe someone's parents are divorced. So yeah, we just kind of like are set out to make it more approachable and make people realize, or maybe perhaps make kids who have different and non-traditional families really realize that at the end of their day, their family might be more normal than they think.
And from your podcast, can you think off the top of your head, what's your favorite episode that you recorded?
Oh, there's been a lot. I would say one of the more interesting episodes actually was the last one that just aired. It was a 2-part series where we interviewed a sperm donor who discovered that he had 97 biological children.
Wow.
It's shocking. And one of the first things that my daughter asked him was like, wait a second, how did that happen? Because because we've talked a lot about this, that like most sperm banks, or really what they're supposed to do is limit the families. So after there's like 10 families, which is still like a pretty big number for a family, after 10 families, they're supposed to kind of pull him from the market so that there can't be, hundreds and hundreds of children from the same donor.
Right.
But what he told us was that the sperm bank that he used, called Zytex, told him that they were limiting to 40 families, which still is an incredibly shocking number, because even if every one of those families had 2 kids, that's like, it's still 80 kids, right? But he said that they lied or were they were dishonest, because it ended up being something like 60 something families. And so they also told him that he would be able to remain anonymous. And that was also not incredibly truthful, because when some of the kids turned about 11, one of the moms found him on Instagram, which was an interesting experience for him.
Wow.
So yeah, we had a great conversation with him. His name's Donor Dylan. And I think it was really good for my daughter to also hear from the perspective of somebody who had been a sperm donor, since, she's never met her sperm donor and may or may not meet him in the future. And so it gave her some really interesting perspective.
Wow. And so where can we find that episode and your podcast?
So you can find our podcast just about on every podcasting platform. I mean, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Just search for Seeking Different. We're also on Instagram at Seeking Different.
Awesome. And I'll also have that podcast link, Lambs, in the show notes below, so you could easily go listen to that episode and all the other episodes on Seeking Different. I'm definitely going to listen to that episode after we record this.
Oh,
that's crazy.
My mind was blown.
That is crazy.
It was super interesting.
Wow. So what I want to do now is we're going to go ahead and pivot, and we're going to go ahead and get into your case. And then I know you have something else that we are going to talk about. So we'll do that towards the end. So please let me know your story. And Lambs, like I said, stick around to the end, because the questions that I have for Hera and what she also wants to bring to you is very, very interesting. Can you tell us about your story? Just start from the beginning, and I won't interrupt you. Take it away.
I'll try to give you the elevator pitch version. Essentially, oh man. So this happened at least a decade or so ago. Back in about 2010, I went on Match.com, which, if any of you who are as old as I am, back in 2010, it was not sexy or popular to be dating online like it is now. But, I had just moved back to the United States from serving overseas with the government. And, I was pushing 30 and all the societal pressures, and, really wanted to settle down and meet someone and have kids. And so I got on Match.com. I met a man named Joaquin Rams, and he seemed very charming and kind of love bombed me for the first few months. And have you heard the term love bomb before?
I haven't, but I could kind of figure out what it means. But go ahead and explain it.
Like, if anyone has ever been involved with somebody who is on the psychopathy or psychopath spectrum, or really just a lot of narcissists do this too, but somebody who's just just bombing you with affection, right? And it's it's hard to see through that, especially if you've never had it happen to you before, and it can be really flattering. And so this was happening, and it was just very whirlwind. It was wow, he's great. And a lot of times people like this kind of just mirror back to you. So, he was intently listening to what I wanted and what I thought about things. And, it was oh, you want that? I want that. Right. Just very, very attuned to how to hook you in. Right.
Right.
And so he pretty much lied about almost everything about him. And I think, what I tell people, the danger of internet dating is that, because it's still somewhat, I don't know if you can call it non-traditional anymore, but at least at the time, and probably now too, traditionally you would meet somebody who you had some connection to. Maybe you met them at school, you met them at work, or through a friend. So there was some external way to validate or vet who they were. Right. Or if you lived in a small town, maybe you knew the person's aunt, right? But with internet dating, I mean, Joaquin and I never would have met, because we didn't live, we lived maybe an hour away from each other. We weren't in the same circles. We didn't have the same education. I could go on and on. We were just two different type of people. But I also had several failed relationships with people who were in my circle. So I was I'm going to step outside my comfort zone, and I'm going to date somebody that I wouldn't normally date.
Right. Let's try something new.
Right. And so, he seemed like a great guy. He told me he was in the entertainment industry. I was cool. I don't know anything about the entertainment industry, and I'm just glad it's not my industry. Right. So I was okay, this will be fun. Interesting stories. And then he also told me that he owned his own like contracting business. And so I was like, okay, on its face, he seemed like he was doing pretty well. Like he drove a Mercedes truck. He lived in a 5-bedroom house in Bristow, Virginia. And he was also raising his son by himself. And so at the time, I assumed like, wow, like somebody who has sole custody of their kid, like must be pretty squared away. That was
Now, sorry to interrupt. This is, he told you this or you knew this?
Well, I mean, his son lived with him and like there was no other person in the picture. So, I mean, I made a lot of assumptions, but when we had spent a lot of time together, like it was clear that his son was always there. Right.
Understood. Got it.
There was really never a moment where he like went somewhere else. And so, so, I mean, he seemed like any other person would assume like, oh, this person's paying for their house. They're, gainfully employed. And at least in the beginning, he was doing stuff like buying $10,000 entertainment centers in like a given day. And I was with him when this was happening. So I was like, man, that's a lot of money. And like, I was gainfully employed and did good for myself, but I was like, I can't spend that kind of money. I don't even make that much money in a month,
Right.
And so, so it was just, there was nothing, at least initially, that would point to like, wow, this man is lying. It was just like, okay, well, he's different than me. In about, I would say like 6 months into the relationship, no, 3 months into the relationship, he started talking about marriage. And I knew it was like a little bit too soon, but I also, I was at the point in my life where I was like, oh my gosh, finally somebody wants what I want, right? Like somebody wants to settle down. Didn't intend on getting married to him at 3 months, but at least I was like, okay, this is, on a track for like a serious relationship. Also, like I said, very naive. We probably about 6 months into the relationship, I got pregnant and we were not married. We were not engaged. And I was also, I would say at that point, I am not anti-abortion, but I also was the type of person that was like, look, I'm old enough, I'm financially responsible enough, and I want kids. So I'm going to have my son. Right. And at the time I figured like I was going to be in a partnership with his father. Right. That was right around the time that things started falling apart. Like I felt like when I got pregnant with Prince, who's my son, it was almost like a mask came down. So like it's like the only way I could describe it. It's like he literally turned into a different person. And yeah, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say there weren't red flags before. There were, but they were nothing, people like this don't walk up to you and like punch you in the face and say, hey, you want to have a baby with me? Like, that's not how it works. Right.
Right.
And so, but at the time that I was pregnant, I was like, I come from a very, somewhat traditional Christian background, and you stay with the father of your child. Right. And so at that time, when things started unraveling with him, my first thought was like, maybe he's going through some kind of mental health crisis, because he was talking about, his finances falling apart. And he was saying that like his career wasn't going well. And mind you, like I didn't have any evidence, like no shreds of evidence that he was actually a musician, other than the fact that he had a recording studio in his house that he was constantly in. But I like never saw him in concert or anything. And so I started getting doubtful about that. But then he started producing people in his life. Like he had this aunt and uncle that I later learned were not actually related to him, that said they'd seen him in concert, and they were bolstering his story. So I was like, man, like who has people lie for them, right? And they said they were family. He had like attorneys that told me that they were his entertainment attorneys, and like they were actual real attorneys who are still practicing today.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And so like it wasn't like there were no signs or there were no people bolstering him, but it still was like, it was weird that I had been with him for now almost a year, and like, I'd never seen him in concert. I'd never seen any other evidence other than like people in his life. who were saying that this was true, right? And so as his mental state deteriorated, I mean, he just became more violent. Like, he would pop off about stuff and like throw things at me. He started getting really violent with his son, who was living in the house with us.
Wow.
And he also had he had a weapon, he had a gun, and like and it's crazy because like as soon as I became pregnant, like the gun started showing up everywhere. Like at one point I felt like it was like the third, like it was like the love triangle between in our relationship. It's like he'd always have it. And it was like his form of coercive control for me and his son. It was like, if you don't do what I want, like I'm going to threaten you with my weapon. And he'd always used to say like, oh, I'm allowed to have this. I have a concealment license. And so it got to the point where I just kind of felt trapped. And it was scary. I mean, it was also like the type of situation where his older son was there and I knew I didn't have a right to him. And it got to a point where I was like, I can't leave this kid in this house. But I think it all really came to a head. Prince, my son, was born July 1st, 2011. 2 weeks later, Joaquin had asked me if he could take my sister to a concert. Now, mind you, my entire family, like at this point, did not like him because he was doing what typical psychopaths do and, tries to separate you from your family. And so I use this as an opportunity. I'm like, oh, he's extending a fig leaf. This will be great. They'll go out and maybe like she won't hate him as much. But the night they returned from the concert, I was home with his older son and my son and him, of course. And my parents came to get me and they were like, Prince, you and Prince need to come with us. And I was like, what's going on? Like, here I'm panicking. Like, what has happened here? Like, why is everybody going crazy? And that's when I learned that Joaquin raped my 19-year-old sister that night. And I just like, it felt like somebody had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. I was like, it's almost like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Get Out, but like being in the sunken place.
Yeah.
Like I was in the sunken place and I just could not imagine it was almost like I was seeing him for the first time, and he was evil. And I was like, we have to get out of here. And so I went to follow my parents out of the house. His older son wanted to come with us. But of course, if I had taken him, it would have been kidnapping. And Joaquin came after me and ended up holding me at gunpoint at the door and was like, if you try to leave me, I'm just going to kill you like I killed Sean. And I was like, who the fuck is Sean?
Yeah, right.
Like, who's Sean? And so I got away. Like, luckily my dad was there and he also had a weapon. So he was like, you better stand down or this is going to get ugly for all of us. I naively called the police. And at that point I thought like, oh, like if you're ever in danger, like perhaps getting held at gunpoint at, on your porch, call the police, because I had, literally just left this house with my 2-week-old son still bleeding from childbirth. And all of our stuff was still in the house. I was like, I have to go in and get my work computer. I can't just let Joaquin have all this stuff. And so I felt like I had to call the police. And when the police arrived, as soon as they spoke to him, he started name dropping police officers that he knew that he was friends with. And like all of a sudden the police officers' demeanor changed. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? And so they called us into the station. Now I know, like in hindsight, I should have just left and, just gone about my business. Like after I got my stuff, I should have just left. I should have been like, I'm not giving any statements. I'm just going home. Right. But of course, at that time, I was like, there's been a rape. Like we have to do something about this. And I went and I cooperated and I talked to the police. I don't think we got home until like 6 a.m. the next morning. Like, and the very next day, my sister and I found out that the police were not going to charge him for rape, and instead they were going to charge us for false and obstruction of justice, because the police said that we had lied about the whole thing.
Wow.
I was gobsmacked. Like I was like, how on earth does this happen? Like I could not even believe it. So this all happened in the state of Virginia, and my parents lived in Maryland. And so after that incident, obviously, I wasn't going back to Joaquin's house. So Prince and I went to my parents' house in Maryland. And I filed for full legal and physical custody of my son that same week, like a couple days later. I didn't hear from Joaquin for months. And so, naively, I was like, oh, like maybe we're good. Like maybe he just went away. But I also, in preparation for a potential custody fight, I thought to myself, like, I need to figure out who this person was that I was with, because the person that I fell in love with was obviously not the same person that he became, or maybe that was what he was the whole time. So I hired a private investigator, and I guess about a month later, he came back with a report, and I remember driving, and he was like, Hera, are you sitting down? And I was like, no, I'm driving. And he's like, I think you're going to want to pull over for this. And what he proceeded to tell me was that Joaquin's name was actually not Joaquin.
Cliffhanger Kai's back, and you know what time it is. Time to get into some audiobooks. With my sponsor, Audiobooks.com, you have access to over 10,000 free audiobooks for use in their free app that goes on either Apple or Android, so you don't have to stop what you're doing to listen to your favorite book. Now, all you have to do is download your audiobooks and listen on the go. So if you like interviews such as the one that I'm doing right now, you can listen to biographies, such as the biography by Anna Rustin called Secret Slave Kidnapped and Abused for 13 Years. This is my story of survival. If you want this and other titles, just click on my link in the show notes below and sign up for audiobooks. You will get 30 days free access plus 3 free audiobooks to get you started. After that, you just choose the plan that you want to continue with and get your audiobooks today. murderandlove.com/recommends/audiobooks. However, easiest way is just clicking on the links in my show notes below. And now, back to the show.
His original name was John Anthony Ramirez. And he had told me he was 26, but he was actually like 33. He had forged a birth certificate of some sort in the state of Virginia and like was able to legally change his name and his date of birth. And the crazier part is that he changed his name to his son's name 6 months before his son's mom was shot in the head.
Oh.
And after she was killed, he claimed that the death benefits, like her life insurance policies, were for him. He was like, oh, look, it says Joaquin Rams, when in fact they were for her son.
Wow.
Yeah, she was also shot on the eve of their custody hearing, which, isn't a coincidence. He found her. His when I looked at the police file, like it was insane that they did not arrest him that night. What they told me was that he bled all over the crime scene, and so he basically tampered the crime scene. He agreed to take a polygraph, after which he failed multiple times on the polygraph, but you can't use that in criminal court, so it was not admissible as evidence. But basically, the police were like, we knew he did it. So he had custody of his older son, but it was because the mom was dead.
But if they knew he murdered the mom, I don't know. My brain is frying right now.
The prosecutor to take the case, and they kept saying they didn't have enough evidence. Wow. Which is bananas, because I've spoken to the police officer who was on the scene. She was ready to arrest him that day, but the prosecutors wouldn't go forward with the case, and even her own boss wouldn't support her. And so it's pretty much, it's nuts.
Were they among the officers that he knew?
Perhaps same departments, all the same little incestuous, neighborhoods out in the state of Virginia. His son also reported him for child abuse multiple times, and he never got in trouble. Like at one point he had physical marks all over him, and CPS had a finding of physical abuse, but it just went away. Like everything that had to do with him went away. A few years after Sean was murdered, his own mother died in his home with a plastic bag laying over her head. And when police arrived, there was a suicide note. The suicide note was in the handwriting of his then girlfriend, not in the woman's handwriting.
Wow.
Joaquin had scratches all over his face. Now I know this because I've read the police reports. I've read I got my hands on the report, the coroner's report. It was crazy. I'm like, you can't commit suicide by pressing a bag to your face. You would pass out and then the bag would fall off, and you'd start breathing. Like there's no physical way to do this. But the police got a hold of it and they ruled it a suicide, and he had her cremated before the rest of her family was even notified.
Wow.
His family to this day thinks that he killed her because just like the first murder, he convinced her to put all of her life insurance policies in his name, and then she turned up dead.
So far, by my count, he's gotten away with 2 murders.
Yep. This is number 2. So, I'm hearing this, I'm reading this in this report, and this PI was a homie. Like he was like bugging cars. He was digging through trash. He was talking to neighbors. He found his older son's grandmother, the mom of the woman who had died. He found Joaquin's family members, the ones that had all said that they didn't believe it was a suicide. He found former girlfriends. He found former business partners who had reported that he had physically assaulted them, and they couldn't get the police to actually charge him for physical assault. They had reported that he had stolen money from them. Like it was astonishing how much shit this man got away with in the state of Virginia, and nobody did anything about it.
How? How? Oh my God.
I mean, I have lots of theories. I have not been able to prove any of my theories, but I mean, I think he was involved in some kind of trafficking ring, and that he had something on these police officers. There's no other explanation. So, with all of this evidence, I marched right into the DA's office and I'm like, hey, sir, like, what are we doing here? Because I'm like, even if you refuse to believe that he killed these 2 other people, even though you and I both know he did, right? At the very least, I can prove with these documents that he obtained a concealment license with a false identity because he forged the date of birth. Like he changed the date of birth to get these records, which is a crime. And they were like, well, that's not really enough. And like, we can't just like go after him for that. And I'm like, why not? And the prosecutor at the time said that she was not going to speed up her case, her criminal case, to influence my custody case. And I'm like, this isn't even to like, do me a favor. This is to save my kid. Right. So yeah, after about 3 months or so, we still hadn't heard from him. And then he responded to my custody case asking for full custody. We fought in court for about a year after that. I think the whole case cost me about $150,000 in the year that we were in court.
Oh my God.
At first, he was given supervised visitation, pending a psychological evaluation. But the court said to him that he could choose his psychological evaluator. So he picked a woman who was not actually licensed to test adults in the state of Virginia, which I did not find out about actually until afterwards.
And the court should have done their due diligence.
Oh yeah, no, they didn't check. They don't care. They check the boxes, right?
Yeah.
So the judge actually told me in open court that my son would have to come back to me with cigarette burns on his back in order for it to be considered a child in need of action case.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah. And I think that one of the most frustrating things was that all of the evidence that was in the court or in Child Protective Services against Joaquin was in the state of Virginia, and states don't actually share with each other. And so the only person who could have brought the Child Protective Services, like his son had had a restraining order against him for a period of time. But the only person who could have brought that evidence in would have been Joaquin himself. And of course, like, he's not going to do that.
He's not going to do that. How old is his son who got a restraining order?
He got a restraining order when he was 10.
Wow.
Because he beat the crap out of him. But the crazy thing is CPS put the kid back in the house. Yeah, they gave him a restraining order, but then put him back in the house. And Joaquin proceeded to terrorize this child for the next month and be like, you better recant your story. Crazy. So there was, there was evidence. We just couldn't actually get it into the court. I mean, I did have a police officer from the state of Virginia come in, and she was like, yeah, he's the sole suspect in this murder. But the judge was like, yeah, that's not, he hasn't been convicted. And so they gave him unsupervised visitation. And on the fourth unsupervised visitation, he killed him. And about 2 weeks after that, I learned that when Prince was about 3 months old, right before he responded to my custody case, he had taken out over $500,000 in life insurance, death, and benefits on him. And
wow,
he told the insurance companies that I was deceased. And so they didn't bother to check. So
people are just money bags to him. That's all he sees.
Oh, totally. Like, but I mean, the thing that's crazy about it is, I'm about a decade removed from this, right? And I've been thinking a lot about the situation, and people are like, oh, you must feel like justice has been served, because like in 2017 he was finally convicted of capital murder, and like he's never getting out. But I'm like, we all know he's crazy, right? The thing that makes me feel like justice really hasn't been served is, think about all of, like, I should never have met this man, right? He should have been in prison like 10 times over
a long time ago
I ever met him.
Exactly.
And so, I blame the police officers who refuse to do anything. I blame Child Protective Services who basically just put this poor child back in the house to let him continue being abused. There was no paper trail. Like, at the time, like, Google existed, but he had no paper trail. Like, with all this stuff happening, I literally had to hire a PI and pay for someone to knock down doors,
Yeah.
To find the data. And if any of these people had done their job, my son would still be here, or maybe my son never would have been born. And as much as I love Prince and I would have given anything to raise him, if I'm honest, he should never have been here.
I understand where you're coming from. Definitely. Wow. So I just want to know, when CPS told you that he has unsupervised visitation, when you first heard that, how did you feel?
So it wasn't the judge. I mean, it wasn't CPS. It was the judge in Maryland. His name's Judge Michael Algio. He thankfully stepped down after my son's murder, citing personal and professional reasons.
Yeah.
Which you can all imagine. I also filed a complaint against him, which hopefully expedited that process. But yeah, I mean, I felt hopeless. I mean, it was like literally knowing that you were sending your child across a minefield, and you just had to pray that he wasn't going to hit the mine that day. I had been talking to organizations and other attorneys just to try to see if I could appeal. But I think the biggest issue is, I mean, there wasn't any evidence in Maryland. And the evidence that existed in Virginia, I didn't have access to. None of it was admissible in court. I mean, I tried to get it as much into court as possible. And I did have some really great witnesses, like, ex-girlfriend came, his, older son's grandmother was there, but the judge really wouldn't hear any of it, because I think part of the problem was that in family court, there's so many misunderstandings, and so many judges don't want to be there. And this particular judge was a professor at American University in criminal law. And so I think in his mind, he was like, well, he hasn't been convicted. But, anybody who knows the law well enough should be able to say, well, criminal court has a different threshold for than civil court, and family court is civil court. So he didn't need to prove without a reasonable doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt that Joaquin had killed those two people. He just needed to believe that it happened and that he was abusive and that abuse was likely to occur again, which I think we had met that threshold.
Right. I mean, how hard is it for you to at least just take this step of supervised visitation?
And that's the thing. I mean, I think part of the problem is that in our country, we care more about the rights of parents than the rights of children. I thought a lot about like why that is. And I think part of it is, parents make the money, parents are the voters. And I say all the time, like, I feel like it's an extreme privilege to be a parent. I don't think it's a right. I think the right that's in the situation is that the child has a right to safety. And so when two parents come into family court, I mean, we just, as a society, have to realize that there are going to be parents that just aren't fit to be parents. And should they still have a right to be a parent? Like, no, I don't think so. When their right, when their right to be a parent is directly harmful to a child, like the kid should matter more.
Yes, I completely agree. And in a lot of my episodes that I do involving children, and kind of like your scenario where, there's been red flags up and down, painted up and down the street, and nothing's happening until something does happen. But by that time, it's too late. I think these laws need to be changed. I don't know to what, and I don't know how to get people to hear this, but something needs to happen. Like, this is ridiculous.
I mean, there's a lot of organizations out there, a lot of them that I work with. I was actually just on Capitol Hill yesterday testifying in a congressional briefing about child safety. And what I was talking about as, my piece on the panel was really that right now there's no federal incentive. I mean, the government really doesn't have a lot of control when it comes to mandating what the states do with things like family court. But what they can do is they can provide incentives for states to share with each other. And I think what we have to realize is that we don't live in an isolated society, right? Like, there's a lot of people who live in one state, work in another, kids who cross state lines to go visit another parent. And, unless we were in an isolated situation where you could have the evidence within your state, you need the states to cooperate with each other. I also think that the federal government should be having some oversight on CPS organizations when it comes to how long they have to retain the data. Because right now, I mean, imagine a child who's sexually abused. There should be no statute of limitation on when that child could accuse the perpetrator. But if the original CPS report is gone, how much harder does it make that, right? And there's nothing saying how long they have to keep these records.
I mean, and that's just the bare minimum, just making sure that states share records. That's a bare minimum in this day and age. Like, are you kidding me?
It's 2023. And so, all of the money that our government spends on loads of stuff that is like silly and ridiculous. All I'm asking is like, find a piece of software and incentivize these states that you're going to pay for the onboarding of this software and their use of this software as long as they share their data. Like, to me, that's not hard. I mean, but the more in the last decade, the more I learn about the crazy things happening to kids in this country, it makes me sick. I just spoke to a woman yesterday, 24 years old. Her name is Ali Toyos. She is currently a student at NYU. But she testified about a time when the courts forced her and her sister into something called a reunification camp, which was basically like a dirty motel. And for months and months, they were forced to be in these horrible circumstances and away from their mom. And the camp people were basically like, you can't leave until you say that you lied about your dad. Their dad was sexually abusing them.
Oh, and
so basically it was like psychological torture. And the court ordered this.
What? Oh my God. You're telling me stuff I didn't even know about.
No, it's crazy. Like, it is nuts. And so part of the reason we were on Capitol Hill yesterday, and meeting with, we met with the director of the Office of Violence Against Women. And we were talking about these camps, and it's like they are literally kidnapping children. and psychologically terrorizing them. There's no oversight to these places because they call themselves psychoeducational facilities. So they don't even have to have like licensed therapists.
What's the end game to this, though? That's what I'm not getting.
To send children back to abusers. And the thing that's really horrible is that there's so much money in this. Like, think about how much I spent on my case, $150,000 to attorneys. They make out like fat rats.
Got you. That's what I was trying to figure out. What's the end game? Money. That's what it is. Oh, and this
reunification camp that this poor girl had to go to, she said that it cost $40,000. And the dad sued the mom, and the mom, who had been the survivor of domestic violence, ended up having to pay for this camp where her kids were psychologically tortured.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's nuts. Like it's nuts.
You're literally bringing. Let me tell you just this one little thing. I had a friend, one of my best friends in high school. Throughout all of high school, her only dream was to become a lawyer. She went to college. She did it. She became a lawyer. She started trying to advocate for children. Mm-hmm. So she was a lawyer and she quit. She said she couldn't do it because she would be fighting for children's rights and the court would just put the children back with the abusive parents. And then she's like, to see either the father or the mother's face when they found out they won. She said she couldn't do it. She quit her lifelong dream and she quit.
I mean, I get it. Like, it's hard. I mean, literally the only reason that I can still even advocate for this is because I use a sperm donor. I mean, like I said at the beginning of the episode, like I knew that, I felt in my bones that I was put on this earth to end this, or at least be part of the change that I wanted to see in the world. And I'm like, I can't do this if I have to constantly be anxious about my kids end up in that situation. And the only way I could think of to make that not happen is to never co-parent.
So you feel like, and either way you answer, I completely understand, like seriously. So you feel like you would never be able to trust a guy around you or your children again?
I'm not a very binary person when it comes to things like this, so I won't say never, but I will say that, when I was with Joaquin, like I had all these boxes I felt like I had to check off, right? And I was like all about the respectability politics of like, okay, first you're married, then you have the 2.5 babies and like the white picket fence. And I just grew up and have a lot of PTSD. And so it's not that I couldn't do it per se. It's just, and I still do hope one day to meet my life partner and, find my person. It's not that. It's just that anybody who really, truly loves me and hears me will understand that I need to be in the type of relationship where we both choose to be there every day. And there's not like this legal binding hanging over our heads.
Understood.
And so it's not to say I wouldn't, it's just that like, it would really, I can't imagine it at this point in my life. Right. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to my children, I mean, I was in a pretty serious relationship right before I started trying for my second. And I remember we were standing somewhere and he was like, when we get married, like, you're going to take my last name. Right. And I was like, no. And he was offended. And I'm like, first of all, I'm an author and I'm like a public person at this point. And like, I have a name that's like, part of my brand. And also my daughter has my last name, so I'm not taking yours. And he was like, well, I just assumed I would adopt her. And I'm like, well, that's a weird assumption knowing who I am. Right. And I think for me, I feel like for me to ever get to the point where anybody would even come close to adopting my kids would have to come to me with like a briefing and, and
PowerPoint
slides. But I mean, also like, I just feel very strongly that like they would have to choose the person. Right.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And they get to, because we have that freedom in our family. Like I can choose who is around my kids. And if they're a positive and healthy person, then they'll get to be around my kids and they'll get to be around me. But I don't want to have to feel like somebody I mean, there's just, I don't know, like maybe I'm just super jaded, but I think in 2023, a woman no longer needs a man to open a bank account. And I, I want companionship, but I certainly don't feel like I need it legally.
Right. Eesh. And I mean, coming from your background, I could totally, like you said in the beginning of the show, you'll understand where I'm coming from. I totally understand where you're coming from.
I don't know. Like, I hate feeling like I am a very skeptical, non-trusting person because I do have a lot of trauma. I try to be a little bit balanced, and I've definitely gone through a lot of therapy, right? But I still know myself well enough to just know that, like, I think for me, like, I would feel safe with somebody who understood.
And you just actually mentioned therapy, and that was kind of my next question. How did you find the strength just to go through this difficult time and support your girls?
Oh man. I mean, I wish I could say that I was like totally put together the whole time. Like, I think like about a month or so after he died, it was just like I don't even remember half that time.
I can't even blame you.
I do remember feeling a lot of rage, and I think sometimes rage was what got me out of bed, which is, something I'm thankful for to a degree. But I also remember standing over the casket at the wake. And I remember I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, I have two choices. I could either get in here with him, which I did consider, or I could keep living. And I realized, like, if I get in there with him, he's going to be dead for sure, gone, right? Because right now, like, I'm all he has left. And so I made him a promise, and I was like, Prince, I wish this had never happened. I wish you had not had to be the kid. And I know that you weren't the first, but I want you to be the last. And so I first, like, I made it a mission to get this fucker in prison. Like, it took them 3 months to arrest him.
And that's what I was going to ask. Wow, 3 months.
It took them a month to get his older son out of the house.
Oh, what?
I know. It was crazy. I think they ended up using like dental records or something ridiculous. I was like, you have got to get that kid out of there.
Oh my God. Where is he now? Do you know?
He is doing well. He was he went to the Air Force. He went to live with his grandma after it happened.
Okay.
And they're great. Like, I think anybody coming from that situation would have a lot of trauma. And I'm sure he certainly has his fair share of trauma. He and I still talk. He actually just texted me like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Yeah, I tell him every once in a while that he was my first child. Because in many ways, I didn't have any kids when I met him, and he didn't have a mom. And so even though we only lived together for a year, I think there's definitely something like perhaps eerily strange or terrifying, or also bonding, that like, of all the people that lived with Joaquin in his adult life, we're the only two that has survived it.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah.
Another question I have for you is, what do people misunderstand most, you feel, in your opinion, about people who have gone through like this type of tragedy?
I think that there is a natural protective mechanism to be like, oh, there must be something wrong with her because this would never happen to me, right? And I understand, because I was that person, right? I thought I was smart. I thought I was savvy. I think that it's scary to realize that it could happen to anyone, which is why people kind of hold that belief, because it's like protective. And yeah, I think the misunderstanding really is that people just, they hear these crazy stories and they automatically jump to the conclusion that this could never happen to them. Which is, I think a naive misunderstanding that's also fairly dangerous. Like, for me as a mom of two little girls, I try to be balanced. I don't want them to like be fearful through life, but I also want them to understand that they have to go into relationship with their eyes wide open, and that they also have to be conscious of what society is telling them, because I think that was like one of the biggest challenges for me at that age, because I didn't, I had grown up in a pretty sheltered community full of people who had, similar moral compasses. And, I also trusted the police and thought that they would be protective. And so, yeah, I mean, I just want my girls to know that, like, you don't have to get married. You don't have to get married on a timeline. You don't have to have babies on a timeline. Like, you know what? Like, this is your life. Like, find healthy people to surround yourself with, and don't ever feel like you are trapped because of what society tells you should do at some point.
That is very good advice. And do you talk to your daughters about your son? Do they know, or they're too young right now?
No, I mean, so they're 4 and 10. Prince is part of our family, so we definitely, I definitely think my daughters probably have some generational trauma that they won't be able to escape from. And we have to talk about it, right? Like, I don't lie to my kids. I think sometimes people don't give kids enough credit. I mean, I certainly don't try to overwhelm them with all of the evils of the world, but for me, I mean, I've been telling them that I'm a single mom by choice and that I chose a donor from like day one, and I wanted them to know why.
And I appreciate people who are open with their children and don't lie to their children. And that's totally how I am with my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand that children are people. They may be little, but they're people. And
and you can scale it,
Yeah. With your past experiences, whether good or bad, they're going to learn from it. So I appreciate that this is the path you chose. What advice would you offer to others who might be going through like similar grief or dealing with, I want to call it complicated family dynamics, but I more mean like the house of Joaquin?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Like, I think another misunderstanding is people are like, why didn't you leave? Right. And I'm like, I will never ask a survivor of domestic violence why she didn't leave, because it is the most obnoxious question someone can ask. Because I guess it's hard, right? Because I think everybody's situation is different. But I would probably say that women need to make sure that they have a strong community of people around who are always going to be honest with them. And if in the moment that they feel afraid or scared, try to leverage your community, and don't let the person you're with isolate you from them to the point where you have nobody, which a lot of these abusers try to do. And I also would say, I mean, look, some people I have spoken to over the past decade, because I speak to a lot of survivors and people who are, in these situations still. And one of the things I tell them frequently is, don't use your attorney as your therapist, because it's expensive and they're not going to help you. And you need to find a good therapist. You need to find somebody who understands personality disorders, who understands complex PTSD, even if they've just worked with war vets, because it is, eerily similar in many ways. And not going to therapy if you've been through an extreme trauma like this is like breaking your leg and refusing to cast it and then wondering why you can't walk straight 5 years later. So yeah, it's like necessary, and sometimes a therapist can also kind of help you work through how to leave if it feels like you're trapped.
I have a twofold question. First of all, before I forget, I wanted to know, how is your sister doing?
She's doing amazing. One of the biggest miscalculations that Joaquin made was, I think he thought that I would be on his side, and he miscalculated that my sister is my best friend, and she's probably the person on the planet that I trust the most. And so there was never a moment when, like, there was just never a moment I wouldn't have chosen her.
Yes.
And that was something that, I think he thought like, oh, this will be the thing that finally like gets her away from her family. And it didn't work. It backfired on him. But she's doing fantastic. She is in law school right now. Also one of the smartest people I know. And she is going to make an amazing attorney someday, and hopefully in some way work to take the system down.
I'm happy to hear that she's doing that. This whole story is hurting my heart. I'm so happy to hear that she's doing good. And the second part of my question was, when you think about Prince now, like, how do you feel? Is it more hope, and you feel you think about the good times, or how do you feel when you think about Prince today?
Oh man. I was just telling another survivor yesterday who was like a little bit like less removed from her situation than me. It doesn't, like, the grief you feel and the pain you feel doesn't get smaller. I think we just grow. It's like it stays the same size, but we grow, and so it feels different. I think that in many ways, the grief isn't necessarily at the forefront of my mind, like at every given second of every given day. But I think where it shows up is moments when I am experiencing joy with my daughters. And it is bittersweet because I know my son will never get to experience these moments.
Wow. That's heavy. My last question is going to be, how do you feel about true crime podcasts and podcasters? But before that question, let me ask you about your upcoming book. What can you tell us about it? Like, what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, man, this book has been a labor of love for a decade. And I won't say I've written it like I haven't been like revising it for a decade, but I kind of had to put it down. I started writing it probably a year or two after Prince died, and I just think I was too close to it. And there are parts of the story that, like as I was writing it, I'm like, gosh, people are not going to believe, like, it's hard to go back to how I was feeling at that time when I know what I know now. I have like all this guilty knowledge, right? And so I just had a really hard time, like at the beginning, just like getting the separation from it. But the book is called Defying Silence, and it is hopefully going to come out by the end of this year. That's my goal. And yeah, I think really it's the book that I'm hoping will help people understand. And the way that I describe it, pretty much, like if I could sum it up, like it's the story of how I survived an abusive relationship with a serial killer, how I uncovered systemic incompetence and corruption and forced justice. And this is a story of a little boy named Prince who finally put a serial killer behind bars.
Dude, I didn't even think about that. You're absolutely freaking right. He was a serial killer.
He was, yeah.
Oh my God.
And I'm really hoping, like, I mean, to me, like Prince represents all kids, and I'm really hoping that like my story can be the inspiration that someone may need to speak up, and or like the virtual embrace to comfort them when they're lonely in silence.
Right. And where would we be able to purchase that book when it drops? Where is it dropping to first?
So, I mean, hopefully you'll be able to find it, just about anywhere, like Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It'll definitely be available on Amazon. I can say that for sure. But yeah, I'm hoping it'll be like the Christmas release, Christmas time release, or sooner if I can make that happen. But yeah, one of the reasons I wrote it is like, I just, I have so many ideas, and I also feel like as I've been advocating for change in the last decade, I look at my story and I'm like, there are just it was like the perfect storm, and I joke with people sometimes. I'm like, yeah, my life has been like a bad Lifetime movie. But I think the thing that makes the story interesting, at least from the perspective of like advocacy and policy change, is that different parts of my story hit on so many different problems in the system. It was almost like Prince came with a mission and he was like, let me show you this, let me show you this, let me show you this.
Oh, man. And this book is called Defiant Silence. When it drops, you definitely need to reach out to me with like, hey, the book is out or it's coming out in a week. Or
I would love to.
I know my lambs will want to read this and I want to read it. It's, oh my God. And I told you before we started recording that I might cry. I'm really trying not to.
Oh, no. I was also just talking about this with somebody the other day. I was like, it's sometimes weird. Like I was in this meeting with a congressional staffer the other day and she's crying because she had like a 17-month-old baby. And like, I'm telling her like the elevator pitch of my story and she's just crying. And it like, it's always like slightly strange for me because like I feel awkward because I've told the story so many times and like I've lived this for the past decade. And I feel weird because I'm like, now I'm like the person standing across from me is like, they're hearing this for the first time and it's shocking, and upset. And they're like, why aren't you crying? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you've dealt with it for so long. Like you said, you've said it. You're probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you probably talk about this by now, it's like on autopilot. So it's not like you're really, really in your feelings, but you're retelling a story.
I've talked about it on documentaries. There was a Discovery Plus show called Citizen PI that the 5th episode is actually my episode. It was an episode about people who investigate cold cases. And I think my episode was the only one that like a victim investigated her own case.
But that's strength. That's strength.
But I just felt like I had to. Like I felt like I had no other choice. I mean,
nobody else obviously was doing anything.
Think about it. Like it was crazy. I mean, I was a madwoman. I remember right after Prince died, it was like a month later, and the police in Virginia didn't even announce his death. Like, how you'll hear about it usually in the news, like, oh, toddler dies in home or whatever.
Yeah.
Nothing. No one.
Wow.
And I remember I called a reporter at the Washington Post and I told her my story. And she admitted later, she's like, I didn't believe you. She's like, I had to look it up because I couldn't believe that they didn't even say anything. And she spent her whole day on Thanksgiving of that year listening to the recordings of our custody case. And she called me afterwards and she was like, Hera, this is crazy. And she wrote the first report about it in November of 2012. And it blew the case apart in the media. Like it went viral that day.
Wow. Well,
and so, yeah, the police were mad at me. They were like, oh, we're mad. Like they didn't want me speaking to the media, but I'm like, how else am I going to get you guys to do anything?
Right.
I mean, I had to shame them. I was like, why aren't you arresting him? You've got a serial killer out there. Clearly, when I found out about the insurance policies, they didn't want me to say anything to the media. They were afraid it was going to get out. And the only reason they didn't want me to say anything is because they knew that the public is going to be like, what the hell?
Exactly. Wow. So Hera's podcast is called Seeking Different, and her upcoming book is called Defiant Silence. And when it's coming out, we'll let you know. We'll definitely send you a link of where to buy it, and go and listen to her podcast, Seeking Different. Now, my last question to you is, as someone who's dealt with basically the subject of my podcast, relationships that turned to murder, how do you feel about true crime podcasts and podcasters?
So, I mean, I'm a podcaster myself. So I love podcasts. I love consuming podcasts. I will be completely honest. I do not watch horror films. I cannot watch the Lifetime movies anymore about the crime. I typically don't watch true crime shows. I think I watched the one, I watched the one that I was on, like, because I felt like I needed to review it and make sure it was okay. But yeah, I try to limit that because I think it's scary.
No, I could totally understand where you're coming from. But even though you don't consume it, which I didn't even assume that you did. My question is, how do you feel about like people like me who retell cases about,
I mean, I can see how it would be interesting to people. I mean, I think there's a fine line between like informative for perhaps the sake of policy change and like trauma porn, which I think sometimes, I even say in like the preface of my book, I'm like, I'm not writing this for trauma porn. I'm writing this because I want people to understand how this happened, and so that I can help it not happen to other people.
Exactly. And literally, that's why I do my podcast. I don't do it, and I didn't even know the words trauma porn. I don't do it for people to, find this as entertainment. I literally do it to get, like, if I did your case, I would have done it in the perspective of what the frick is wrong with these police, like these police in your case.
That's the thing that I wish. I mean, I can only hope that someday we will find out what the hell happened. And I am certainly going to do the best I can in my book to make sure I expose these people so that people know what they did. Because after he was convicted, it's like they all scurried back to their little rat hole, and no one ever heard of them again. Like, I mean, there are people out there who have blood on their hands that are still practicing attorneys. There are prosecutors that know that they have blood on their hands, and they took no culpability in any of this.
Yeah. And see, when I do my episodes, this is the standpoint that I take. I take it from that viewpoint. And I've actually had the family of victims and friends of victims reach out to me and tell me that they were happy in how I portrayed their case.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So yeah,
I mean, look, I think it's an important thing. I think people should know that it exists. I think that people just have to also, I think there's a balance, right, between the trauma porn and, informative information, help, also help bring a voice to the voiceless, right? And that's also why I still talk about my son, like he doesn't have a voice anymore. So he relies on me to make sure that people remember him, make sure they know what happened, and make sure that this doesn't keep happening to other kids.
Definitely. And I thank you for your fight. And you brought me some information I didn't even know. And now our interview is coming to a close, and I am going to go and watch some Disney Channel.
Oh, girl, I'm going to be watching Netflix or Facebook.
I have to watch something. This is my ritual after each case, especially when it's a really hard case. I have to decompress. I'm
gotta have balance, right?
Yeah, right.
That's why I don't listen, because I feel like my story is enough of a horror for a lifetime.
Oh my God, I completely understand, and I thank you so much for coming on and doing this interview, because this was such a heavy topic. I really, really appreciate it. Hera McCloud, everyone. Seeking Different is the podcast. You can find the link in the show notes below. Defying Silence is the upcoming book, and we will let you know when it's coming out. So you can go, buy. Support. Thank you, Dee. Is there anything that you want to leave us with?
No, I think that's all. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hera.